If you have your Bible, turn to John 15. John 15, we are in verses 1 through 11. And because Garrett reminded you all of the sermon last week, I don't have to say much as I introduce this text again. But we're in John 15, 1 through 11 for 3 weeks. And last week we looked at what it meant for each of us to abide in Jesus. Today we are looking at these same verses and considering the call to bear fruit. So let's read John 15, 1 through 11, and we'll see what God has for us in His Word. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, He takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, He prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you, unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers, and the branches are gathered and thrown into the fire and burned. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit and so prove to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in His love. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be full. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Imagine with me that you planted an apple tree in your backyard, and you waited around for it for years. And while you were waiting, you did all of the things that you know you needed to do to help that tree grow. You watered it. You kept bugs away from it. You put a little fence around it so that animals couldn't bother it. You fertilized it year after year. You did everything you needed. And at some point, it started to look like a real mature tree. And the first summer that it was mature and looked big enough finally to bear fruit, you went out and looked for apples and found none. And you said, okay, well, it's just maybe I'm a year early. And you went back year 2 of this mature tree, looking full, but there was no fruit on it. And year 3 and year 4, and you went back year after year, and there was no fruit. Eventually, at some point, you would start thinking, what is wrong with this tree? And you'd be right to. Because that tree exists to bear fruit. The fact that it doesn't bear fruit shows that something is wrong. Healthy, alive apple trees bear fruit. That's what they do. And people who have real life in Jesus bear fruit for Jesus. This is the point that Jesus is drawing us to in these verses. Maybe the main idea of these 11 verses is that people who have real life in Jesus bear real fruit for Jesus. Real life in Jesus means bearing real fruit for Jesus. And in these verses, Jesus tells us 3 truths about bearing fruit. First, bearing fruit is our purpose. Bearing fruit is our purpose. Go to verse 5 in the text. Jesus brings us into the metaphor of the vine again. In verse 1, he said, I am the vine, my Father is the vine dresser. In this metaphor now in verse 5, Jesus says, I am the vine, and says to his disciples, the people following him, I am the vine, you are the branches. And then just gives us a truth, a reality. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. Jesus says, I am the vine, and we understand this analogy. Jesus is the one who has life. Jesus is the one who has eternal life in him, and our life is derivative. Our spiritual life does not come from ourselves, but is drawn from him. And if you were to ask this verse, Jesus, why do we have life in you? What is the purpose for us being alive in you? Jesus would say in verse 5, for you to bear fruit. Abide in me and I in you. My life will be in you for this, that you bear much fruit. That you bear fruit. As a branch, you exist to bear fruit for Jesus. Now, I want us to ask two questions about that from these verses. Two that maybe you're even asking, okay, what is that fruit? Okay, I'm a branch. Branches bear fruit. What is it? Think about that. Jesus says you're going to do this. If you have life in me, you're going to bear fruit. What's that fruit? What is the fruit in our lives that we're going to bear for Jesus? And secondly, I want to answer the question, how? Because the vine metaphor finds its culmination. The main point is this: God is bearing fruit in the world. How is he doing it? What is our fruit, and how does God bear fruit? What? Now, what is the fruit? There's a lot of debate about this, actually. If you read scholars and they say, as they look at the context and look at what Jesus is saying here, as they try to identify the fruit that Jesus intends his people to bear, there's a number of common answers. Some of them identify the fruit as obedience. And if you consider the whole context of John 15, that makes sense. Jesus actually talks about the importance of obeying him. So some say, well, the fruit is obeying Jesus. Some say the fruit is love. If you read John 15, 12 through 16, where Jesus gives a commentary on these verses, Jesus highlights the significance, the essential nature of love in the lives of the believers. So some say Jesus is talking about that love. The fruit of our life in him is love for others and for him. Some identify it as evangelism or new converts for Jesus. That if you're alive in Jesus, you're going to bear fruit for Jesus, which means seeing more people come to know Jesus, to come abide in Jesus with you. And as you look at the context again, there's some measure of reason to argue that. Jesus in John 15, 16 is going to say, I've appointed that you go, sounding like the Great Commission, and bear much fruit. And they'll argue for this. Is it love? Is it obedience? Is it for the fruit of evangelism? And I would argue that to try to identify the fruit that we bear in Jesus as one of these things misses the point. It actually tries to take an extremely complex metaphor and reduce it down to making it one thing, when in reality, the fruit that we bear as we have life in us from Jesus is actually going to look like a complex combination of all of them together. And I think that because of the metaphor itself. Follow. Hey, by the way, great job. You got here at 8:45. Half you did. The other half came at 8:55. Still, great job. You guys got here early. I want you to follow this because I think this is really important to understand the context. And I know it's early. Uh, the vine metaphor springs to life in its whole Bible context. We talked about this last week, so I'm not going to go into it again. But you remember, as I read in Isaiah 5, in the Old Testament, the covenant people of God, the nation of Israel, were God's vineyard. They were God's vine. They were the vine that God planted. And why did he do that? Why did God call Abraham and his descendants to himself? Why did God establish a covenant with them? Why did he make them his people? You'll remember that he gave those people a mission. And maybe you could articulate it best in the promise that God makes to Abraham, where God says to Abraham, through you and through your offspring, I am going to bring blessing to the world. Israel's identity was wrapped up in its purpose. They existed to mediate a saving relationship with God to the nations. They were, as God called them, a kingdom of priests. But as you read the Old Testament, you see failure after failure of God's people to fulfill that mission. God did everything necessary for them to bear fruit. God established a covenant with them. They weren't seeking him. He sought them out and covenanted with them. He was faithful to them, and they abandoned it. God spoke his law to them, and they disobeyed it. God planted them in the land. They were nurtured by God, but because of their unfaithfulness to God, they failed to bear fruit to the nations, and God condemns them for it. But God does not abandon the promise that he makes with Abraham to be a blessing to the nations. Instead, Jesus appears on the scene and says in John 15, I am the true vine. So in Jesus, God is both, you see this, God is both continuing the old work of bringing blessing to the nations through Abraham, and God at the same time is starting something new. Israel failed to be a blessing because they failed to obey God. Israel failed to bear fruit to the world because they disobeyed in their unbelief. But now in Jesus, the true vine is accomplishing God's purpose in the world. The nations are going to come in and experience the saving relationship with God that only Jesus provides. So the fruit we bear as his people is advancing the saving reign of Jesus personally and globally. And as soon as I say that, I want you to see, you need to see this, that the mission God gives us and our lives as messengers are connected. Why did Israel fail to bear fruit to the nations? Think, why did they fail to bear fruit? Because they disobeyed. They rejected God's law. Their lives were to be the light, and they failed in their mission. So now Jesus is continuing the old and starting anew, and sending us, his people, his branches, out into the world to bear fruit for him. And he does not send perfect people out into the world, but he does send changed people out to bear fruit for him. The message we carry and our lives as messengers are to be aligned. As Jesus' people, we bear fruit personally and globally as we carry a transforming message accompanied by transformed lives, which is why there's a deep disconnect for us to go out into the world and tell people about the love of Jesus while we give ourselves to deep injustices, right? There's a deep disconnect. Those two things don't go together, and they never have. So what is the fruit that we bear for Jesus? It's advancing the saving reign of Jesus personally and globally. It's love, it's obedience, it's sharing the gospel with Jesus. It's all those things. Why? Because that's the fruit that Jesus is bearing in the world. Which brings us back to a deep reality that we saw last week, that our abiding in Jesus, our identity and our obedience is directly connected to our bearing fruit for Jesus. We will only do this. We will only advance the saving reign of Jesus in this world as we consciously stay connected to Christ. That's the fruit we bear. That's the fruit we bear. We advance the saving reign. Now, I want to go to the question, how? And as I thought about this week, it explodes with significance for our life together as a church. Think about it for a moment. Go back to the metaphor of the vine. A vine without branches bears no fruit. This is an important part of the analogy. A vine without branches bears no fruit. Now, as we think about this analogy more in a moment, a branch on the vine that bears no fruit is worthless, but a vine without branches bears no fruit. How is God advancing the saving reign of Jesus, getting people to be rightly related to him in the world? What is the only way he does it? Through you. How does Jesus bear fruit? First, he is a seed that goes in the ground and dies. He dies and he rises so that life could be given to people. But you have to go one step past that. Because Jesus is the essential, vital means of God saving anyone. And you are not saved if you don't trust in him. You are not saved if Jesus doesn't die and rise again. But God also ordained the means of his people taking that message to the world. There is no fruit for Christ's death and resurrection apart from the branches going out into the world and bearing fruit. Listen to this. God has fully entrusted the mission of Jesus to you. Think about that. That is like mind blown. Everything that God is going to do in the world through Jesus is going to happen through his branches. Nothing else happens. There is no fruit from the vine apart from the fruit that Jesus is bearing in you and I and his people. This is why we exist then, to bear fruit for him. In verse 5, if we are alive in Jesus, we will bear fruit for Jesus. This is why God the Father is the vine dresser in verse 2, that as his people bears fruit, he prunes. Why? So we will bear more fruit. In verse 8, the Father is glorified by our bearing fruit. If you were to skip ahead to verse 16 of John 15, Jesus says, you did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you what? Appointed us as his people to do what? That you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should abide. Northwest Bible Church, why do we exist? We exist to bear fruit for Jesus. We exist to spread his saving reign personally and globally. This happens as we give ourselves and help others, help and give ourselves to helping others obey everything that Jesus commanded, right? That's making disciples. Our fruit increases in the world as our own lives give themselves more and more to saying every day, not my will, but your will be done. God, your kingdom here first, not mine. That's it, advancing personally, and us helping others do the same, and us calling people to know and love God. Northwest Bible Church, we exist to bear fruit for Jesus. The entire reason the branch exists is so that it bears fruit. As one scholar said, the church is the only institution that exists primarily for the benefit of those who are not its member. You and I bear fruit so that other people can know and love Jesus. We exist for this mission. We exist to participate in God bringing the good news of the saving reign of Jesus to all people. So in this involves a call to each of us to die. As Paul said in Galatians 2:20, I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. But it is not I who lives, it is Christ living in me. This is why we exist, so that the life of Jesus would be expressed and manifested and known through us. Bearing fruit is our purpose. Second, bearing fruit is our proof. Bearing fruit is the proof that we are really, vitally alive in Jesus. I want you to look at verse 7. Jesus says, if you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. By this is my Father glorified, that you bear much fruit. Here's how you give God glory. The will of God is brought about in this world through the prayers of his people. By this is my Father glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. In verse 8, Jesus makes an essential point. Bearing fruit proves that we really belong to him. You bear fruit, and your fruit is a testament that you have life. This is stating this principle positively. Real disciples are people who are really abiding and bearing real fruit for Jesus. It's proof that they're real, they're alive. You want to know why the branch is alive? It's got fruit on it. But in verse 2, this reality is stated negatively. Look at verse 2 in your Bible. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. He takes away. Verse 6, what happens to those fruitless, dry branches? They are gathered and they are burned. Verse 2, every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. It is cut off. It is thrown on the ground. This verse is not teaching that you can be a Christian and vitally attached to Jesus, but because you're not bearing fruit, lose your salvation. John, throughout his gospel, has taught that it's possible to be associated with Jesus, to be close to Jesus, but not really know and trust Jesus. The prime example of this is a man well known in John 13 and 14 for his betrayal. It's Judas. Judas was numbered among the apostles. If you looked at the 12, you could not pick out Judas because he was mean and scowling and kicking kids all the time. Right? It wasn't like obvious. Oh, boy, Jesus has 12 disciples, but you know what? This Judas guy, he doesn't fit in. No, Judas was close. By all external appearances, Judas looked like he was in. But he wasn't. He had no life. He abandoned Jesus. He betrayed Jesus. He walked away from Jesus because he was never really in Jesus. So how can you tell the difference? If there are times when the externals look very similar, Jesus tells us, by this, you can tell you bear fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. And this is important because we live in a world full of cheap fakes and imitations. If you wanted to go buy a Rolex, Rolex watch, you would expect to pay around $6,000. I looked it up today. That's how I know that, by the way. I just Googled it. A new Rolex will start around $6,000. Well, when I was 10, I went to Tijuana, Mexico, and I bought a Rolex. And guys, killer deal. I got it for $11, which inflation is like $300 today, but still, it was still a good deal, right? I got a Rolex for $11. I bought it from a guy selling, I couldn't believe how many Rolexes he had, actually. He was selling them on the side of the street, and I bought one, and I brought it home, and I'm wearing it, and he's like 11-year-old. You're just like, yeah, come on. And then my friend's like, oh, you got a new watch? Yeah, it's a Rolex. And he looked at it real close, and he was like, hey, man, that definitely says Bolex. And he was totally right. It was like B-O-L-E, Bolex. I had bought a fake watch. Now, I doubt I will ever be in a position to actually buy a Rolex, and I don't think I could. Obviously, I can't spot a genuine from a fake, even when it's really obvious. And even today, if you put like a good fake and a real one in front of me, I don't know if I could spot the difference. But if you were wanting to know what a real Rolex was, or buying one, you would want some kind of certificate of authenticity. You would want to know how to identify the real from the fake. And for us personally, as we try to follow Jesus, we should want to know what really separates genuine Christians from people who are just pretending to be attached to him. As a pastor, I am deeply concerned that all of us think about this carefully. Because we live in a culture, this might not be true everywhere, but in our culture where you and I inhabit, in the culture we inhabit, we live in a culture where for our entire existence, it has been culturally favorable for you to be a Christian. Did you know, how many presidents have we had? I should have looked this up. We're on 241, right? Nope, that's way too many. 45? 46, thank you, kids who learn history in school. We have had 40, I should know that off the top of my head, by the way. That was a glaring oversight. We've had 46 presidents in our country. 47? See, I'm getting bad data. Okay, this side of the room, you're out. This side of the room is in 47. We've had 47. Did you know that of those 47 presidents, not a single one of them have overtly denied any attachment to Christianity? Saying it another way, all of our presidents have been Christian, nominally. You can make an argument about a couple of them, but for the most part, what does that show you? That in our society, in fact, one of the presidents, the guy he was running against actually said, this guy's not a Christian, don't vote for him. Like he used his fake Christianity as like a smear campaign. Could you imagine that happening today? He fake Christian, don't vote for fake Christians. What does that show you about our culture? That there has been some positive association for people to be at least loosely attached to the idea and the person of Jesus. Now, I'm not saying at all that all those men are Christians. I highly doubt it, actually. But in our context, in our culture, being a Christian will get you ahead socially. There's social advantage to following Jesus. So in a culture where it's really advantageous for us to at least put on some Christian outside persona, How do we distinguish between the authentic and the fake? Fruit in Jesus. This is how you prove to be my disciple. You bear fruit for Christ, and that fruit is everything we talked about. It's having a heart that is growing in its submission to the reign of Christ. It's having a life that is given to help others to do the same. This is how we prove we're disciples of Jesus. In a world full of counterfeits and cheap fakes, our authentic commitment to Jesus will be demonstrated by the fruit that we bear for him. I want to apply this in two ways. First, I want to think about the significance of this as a church. Did you know that Jesus established the visible church, this visible congregation of people? Jesus established the visible church to help mark off people who belong to him and people who don't. Have you ever thought about church membership in this light? That becoming a member of a local church is having a group of Christians look at your life and your gospel profession and saying, as clear as we can tell, those things align. Never perfectly. Right? If you saw me this week, you'd say, man, I can't believe Aaron does some of these things. Right? Because I'm a sinner just like you, and I'm sure you could say those things too, but our church membership exists in its primary form for us to say together as we bring people into membership, as far as we can tell, his profession of knowing Jesus and his life align with one another. And when we practice church discipline, we're saying with love and seriousness and tears in our eyes, we're saying to someone, we have to remove you from this church because your life and your profession do not align. We can't in good conscience tell you that we think you belong to Jesus. There's immense benefit for each of us in this. That the ground of my assurance, the ground of your assurance that you really belong to Jesus is not just about your own personal evaluation. You have literally hundreds of people in your life watching how you live and talk and saying to you every time you come to the table and eat communion with them, we belong to Jesus together. That's what it means to belong to a church. That's why we talk about church membership so often. That's why we encourage it so frequently. Because you and I should want this protective mechanism. You and I should desire this accountability in our lives. And do you know what I think might be the worst thing in the world? Someone who belongs to a church and thinks they're in because they have some loose attachment to Jesus, but that church has never given serious consideration about whether or not their profession and their lives align. They have told that person implicitly that you can be loosely associated to Jesus and okay, but they're actually going to hell. I think that might be the worst. So we think about this, right? We need to think about this. We bear fruit for Jesus to prove that we are his disciples, which means personally, corporately, we think about this church membership together. But personally, we live out what Peter says to us individually. Make your calling and election sure, which on a daily basis, we just ask, Jesus, keep transforming me into your image. We ask ourselves, God, is my life marked by abiding in the commands of Jesus? Jesus, is my life marked by abiding in your love? We just do that all the time. We ask, and we thank God that there's fruit when we look. Bearing fruit for Jesus is the proof that we belong to Jesus. Finally, bearing fruit is promised. I want to end here. Jesus says in verse 5, I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. This passage does give us a real test, but it's a test that Jesus ensures his people pass. We will bear fruit in him. In fact, God is assuring through his kind and severe providence that we will not only bear fruit, but we will be as fruitful as possible. I would encourage you to read verse 2 again in this light. That when you bear fruit, God is committed to the painful work of pruning so that you are as fruitful as possible. Our pain is not God's displeasure, but his kind hand helping us bear fruit. And we have the confidence that in Jesus we will do this. Now, right here in verse 5, two seemingly paradoxical ideas are brought together. Our weakness and God's empowering grace. Do you know what Jesus says at the back end of verse 5? I say this to myself almost every Sunday before I preach. Jesus says, apart from me, you can do what? What can you do without Jesus? Hey, nice job, people. Early crowd, you're getting with it, right? Apart from Jesus, we cannot do some things. We can do nothing. Now, Jesus has just said to us that you're going to bear fruit for the whole world to know and come to know and love him, and yet apart from him, we can do nothing. There's two paradoxical ideas: the immense task that God has given us and our utter helplessness apart from Christ. And yet somehow, these things come together. These things come together, and as we understand the gospel and what we have in Jesus more and more, these two ideas will be joined in our hearts. We will have deep humility. Deep humility. I can't do anything. I got nothing. Jesus, I have nothing apart from you. And yet, even though our lives will be marked by this deep humility, God will produce in us unshakable confidence. Why? I'm attached to Jesus. Which is why Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4, what are we? We hold this treasure in jars of clay, that the surpassing power does not belong to us, but to God. At Northwest Bible Church, we want to combine these two things together, where we can walk in Sunday after Sunday and small group after small group and confess our sins and our failures to one another. We really need Jesus together. And at the same time, we will walk out from here weak, flawed, broken people, and yet deeply confident that through us, God is changing the world. And that is not hyperbole. That is not hyperbole. That's not just Christian talk. Through people like us, weak people like us, God is going to change the world. So we go out and we work to bear fruit, confident that God will do it in us. Northwest Bible Church, that is why we exist. We exist to know Jesus and joyfully make him known. And why do we make him known? Because he's going to bear fruit in us. He's going to bear fruit in us. We have this promise that will not fail. We exist to bear fruit for Jesus, fruit that shows we belong to him, and fruit that we will unfailingly bear because we're connected to him. We exist to know Jesus, and we exist to joyfully make him known. Let's pray for God's help to do that together.